Hi guys, welcome to Bedtime Sleepy, where quiet stories from the past gently find you. The tallow candle had burned down to almost nothing. The light it cast across the writing desk was thin and uncertain, the kind that makes you squint, the kind that makes the darkness pressing against the window feel almost alive. She dipped the quill. She paused. Outside, the streets of New York City churned with the noise of a world that had no real place for her. Not the way she needed it, not the way any woman in her position needed it. The year was 1848, and Eliza Farnham had just buried her husband. She was 33 years old. She had a mind sharper than most men she'd ever met, a record of published work, years of experience running the women's ward at Sing Sing prison, and, by the laws of the United States of America, absolutely no individual legal standing whatsoever. Here's something most Americans were never taught, and it's worth saying plainly before anything else. In 1850s America, a woman without a husband didn't fully exist under the law. Not in the way we understand existence today. She couldn't sign a contract. She couldn't own property in most states, even property she'd worked for herself or inherited from her own family. She couldn't open a bank account in her own name. She couldn't testify in court on her own behalf. She couldn't vote, but it went far beyond voting. She couldn't sue anyone who'd wronged her, and she couldn't be sued, because taking legal action against someone the law had already declared a non-entity was rather beside the point. If she earned wages, those wages belonged, by law, to either her father or her husband. The moment a woman married, the law erased her as a separate person entirely, folding her whole identity into her husband's like a letter slipped inside an envelope, sealed, addressed to someone else, sent. But what happened when that envelope was never sealed? What happened when the husband died, or when there never was one? What happened to the widow scraping together next month's rent on a boarding house income while her children stood watching from a cold doorway? What happened to the 30-year-old schoolteacher who'd spent a decade educating other people's children, but couldn't legally sign her own lease without a man's name beside hers? What happened to the woman who'd been left behind, abandoned by a man who walked west one morning, found himself a brand new life in California, and never gave much thought to the one he'd left? What happened to the women who had made a clear, deliberate choice to live without a man at the centre of their story, and then discovered, slowly and painfully, exactly what that choice was going to cost them? The answer is complicated. And it is, in ways that still run through American life right now, deeply American. Most people don't realize just how many women were living this reality, not as rare exceptions, but as a quiet, overlooked majority in cities across the country. This isn't a story about victims. That needs to be said early, and said firmly, because the pull to reduce these women to tragedy is real, and it would be dishonest. The women who lived without husbands in 1850s, America weren't fragile, weren't passive, weren't waiting around to be rescued. Some of them were running businesses, managing farms, teaching schools, crossing oceans, writing books, pushing hard for rights nobody wanted to give them. Some were doing all of this, while the law refused to acknowledge they were fully human. That's not weakness. That is a particular, extraordinary kind of endurance, working inside a system that was specifically designed to wear it down. But the system had teeth, real teeth, not the kind you talk around. If you were a woman in 1850s America without a husband, you felt those teeth every single day. In the rent, you couldn't negotiate from a position of legal standing. In the job you couldn't hold under contract, in the wages you earned that quietly disappeared into someone else's pocket, in the property you'd inherited that a court could strip from you with barely any ceremony at all. You felt it in the words people used when they thought you couldn't hear, or simply didn't care that you could. Spinster, old maid, widow woman, fallen, each one a small door, quietly closing. We're going to go back, not just to the laws and the legislation and the dry historical records sitting in archives, but to the world itself, to what it smelled like, what it cost, what it genuinely felt like to wake up alone in a country that told you every single morning in 100 quiet and not so quiet ways that you were incomplete. We're going to follow Eliza Farnham through the wreckage of one life and the slow, deliberate construction of another. We're going to meet the women that history almost forgot, the seamstresses and schoolteachers, the widows and wanderers, the ones who found the cracks in a system built without them in mind and pried those cracks open with their own bare hands. And if you're the kind of person who lies awake turning over questions that don't have easy answers, questions about independence, about what a society owes the people it shuts out, about how much has truly changed in 170 years, then get comfortable tonight. If the hidden stories of American women are the kind of history that keeps you curious, consider subscribing to this channel. There are more untold American stories ahead, and every single one of them has something to say about who we still are. Because here's what's haunting about all of this. The women we're about to meet weren't extraordinary in the ways we usually celebrate. They weren't all famous. They weren't all brave in obvious dramatic ways. Most of them were just trying to live, trying to find the next meal, the next room to rent, the next way to be useful in a world that had drawn a very clear line between useful and superfluous, and had placed women without husbands firmly on the wrong side of it. The 1850s in America were a decade of furious motion. The Mexican-American War had just ended, delivering California and a vast sweep of the Southwest into American hands. Gold had been found at Sutter's Mill in January of 1848, and by 1850 tens of thousands of men were pouring west in what was, up to that point, the largest mass migration in the nation's history. The country was expanding at a pace that made people dizzy. The belief that God himself had ordained American expansion from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific wasn't just a political slogan. It was a national religion, a justification for almost anything. The country was young and loud and completely certain about its own future. And right in the middle of all that muscular, forward-charging expansion, women occupied a tightly controlled, carefully defined, and entirely circumscribed place in the national story. What historians call the cult of true womanhood, what people back then simply called common sense or basic decency, held that respectable women embodied 4 essential qualities: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. A true woman was religious. A true woman was chaste. A true woman deferred. A true woman's natural place was the home, organised around a husband and children. That was the entire map of an acceptable female life. Marriage, children, domestic management, and quiet endurance unto death. The trouble, and it was a trouble the era largely refused to name out loud, was that this map left off enormous territories of actual experience. Women were widowed young and often, in an era when childbirth killed somewhere between 1 in 30 and 1 in 50 women, and when men died of disease, accident and violence at rates that would astonish anyone reading this today. Women were deserted. Women chose, for reasons of education, economics, or genuine personal belief, not to marry at all. Women freed from slavery found themselves not only without husbands, but without any of the legal foundations that were supposed to make female survival possible in the first place. Women arrived in a new country without family networks. Women were left behind by men who headed west and simply started over. These weren't edge cases in some distant corner of society. By 1850, the federal census showed that roughly 15% of adult women in American cities were living outside of marriage, widowed, never married, or separated. In some cities, the number climbed higher still, and in California, where the gold rush had created a lopsided sex ratio that bordered on the absurd, women living outside traditional domestic arrangements weren't just visible, they were economically indispensable. Women who could cook, clean, manage a boarding house, or run a laundry found themselves in sudden and intense demand. The free market, completely indifferent to the cult of true womanhood, recognized something that polite society worked very hard not to say out loud. Women without husbands were doing enormous amounts of essential work, and they were doing it for wages that the law didn't guarantee they'd be allowed to keep. What does it actually mean to live in a country that has decided, before you were ever born, that you're only complete in relation to someone else? We're about to step all the way inside that world, into the cold and the cost and the particular grinding loneliness that comes not from lack of company, but from legal invisibility. And we're going to ask, with all the honesty that history allows, how did they survive, and what exactly did surviving cost them? The smell hit you first. In any American city in the early 1850s, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, the air carried things no modern noses prepared for. Horse manure and rotting vegetable matter from the markets, the sharp mineral bite of coal smoke rising from thousands of heating stoves across the city, the thick fatty smell of tallow candles burning in windows up and down every street, and underneath all of it, the deep persistent damp of buildings that had been wet all winter and never quite dried out. If you were a woman living alone in one of these cities in 1852, this was the air you breathed every morning when you pressed your feet to the cold floorboards and decided once more to keep going. The boarding house was the central institution of female survival in mid-19th century America. Not the fine kind with a parlour and a piano, the ordinary kind. A narrow brick building, 3 or 4 stories high, with a landlady who collected every Saturday and didn't negotiate. You rented a room, maybe 8 feet by 10. Maybe there was a small stove if you were lucky, a fireplace if you were luckier still, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall or a back alley where someone was always burning something. You shared a water pump with the other boarders. You shared a privy out in the yard. You brought your own candles. The bed was narrow. The mattress was stuffed with corn husks or straw, and it made a dry rustling sound every time you turned over in the night, which meant you were always aware, however dimly, however half asleep, that you were alone in it. This isn't melodrama. This is the physical texture of the life that waited for a woman in 1850s America if she found herself without a husband. The texture of a life lived in the margins of someone else's social design. Step further back now, away from the cities and out into the countryside, and the sensory world shifts. But the underlying reality doesn't. On a farm in Ohio, Indiana, or the new territories spreading across the Midwest, a woman without a husband woke before dawn to animals that needed feeding. The low, insistent sound of a cow due for milking, the restless shuffling of chickens in their pen. The farmhouse smelled of last night's fire gone cold, of salt pork curing in the back larder, of damp wool, clothes hung near the stove to dry, never quite drying because the stove wasn't warm enough and the house wasn't tight enough, and there were only so many hours in the day. A rural widow in 1852 didn't have the option of simply paying rent. She had the somewhat different burden of holding on to land that the law, in most states, permitted her to inherit, but did not make it easy to keep. Without a husband to sign contracts, she couldn't legally hire seasonal labour in most states, without a male relative or guardian beside her. She couldn't take out a mortgage to repair the barn roof. She couldn't file suit against the neighbour whose livestock had broken through her fence again and destroyed her kitchen garden. She had the land. What she didn't have was the legal machinery to protect it, and the men who wanted that land knew it. The working day for a woman living alone in this era was long in a way that's hard to fully picture from the outside. There was no running water. Everything required hauling. Water from the pump, wood from the pile, coal from the bin, laundry to the tubs and back again. Cooking happened over an open fire or a cast iron stove that had to be fed constantly. Producing a single meal, bread made from scratch, salt pork or beans or whatever the season and the income allowed, something slow in a pot, took hours of physical labour that modern cooking doesn't begin to resemble. And if you were a seamstress working on piece rate from a clothing manufacturer, you sat in that same cold room and sewed by that same thin candlelight until your fingers went numb and your eyes ached. At the end of the week, you carried your finished pieces to the warehouse and received payment that, in early 1850s New York, averaged somewhere between $1 and $2 for 7 full days of work. A decent room in a boarding house cost between $1.50 and $2.50 per week. The math was not encouraging. What strikes me most is how the numbers themselves tell the whole story. There was simply no margin for anything to go wrong. The social texture of the era was just as particular and just as worth sitting inside for a moment. If you were a woman of any standing in the 1850s, middle class, white, living in a respectable neighbourhood, you existed inside a dense web of social observation. Everyone knew whether you were married. Everyone knew how long you'd been widowed. Everyone believed they knew what a woman without a husband said about herself. Respectability wasn't an idea. It was a daily performance, and it was exhausting. You wore black for a prescribed period after a husband's death. You didn't go out unchaperoned. You were careful about which men you spoke to and for how long and in what tone, because your reputation was the only currency you had that couldn't be legally taken from you. And your reputation, if you weren't careful, could be gone after a single afternoon's careless conversation. For working-class women, the social calculation was different, and in some ways more punishing, because respectable poverty had its own rules. You couldn't afford the black dress, so you borrowed one. You couldn't afford to stop working, so you didn't. You walked to the factory or the workshop or the schoolhouse in shoes that let the cold in through a worn-out seam, and you did it without complaint, because complaint was a luxury reserved for people whose lives had some margin in them, and yours didn't. Step into a schoolroom in 1852, a one-room building somewhere in rural New England or the Ohio Valley, and you'd find one of the most common figures in this whole landscape, the female schoolteacher. She was typically young, typically unmarried, typically educated well past the standard of her time, and paid roughly a third of what her male counterpart earned for teaching the same children, the same subjects in similar buildings. She boarded with local families, moving every few weeks to spread the burden of her presence around. She ate what they ate. She slept in whatever room they could spare. She had no security of tenure, no contract that held, no legal recourse if the school board decided in spring that they'd prefer a male teacher or a cheaper one, or someone's nephew who needed the work. Her value to the community was real and recognised. Her standing within it was nearly nothing. This is the world we're stepping into, not a world of pure darkness. Americans in the 1850s weren't all cruel, and there were genuine warmths, genuine communities, genuine kindnesses woven through this time. But it was a world built on a specific set of assumptions about what women were for, and what happened to women who stepped outside those assumptions, by choice or by circumstance, was written into the fabric of ordinary daily life. The cold floorboard, the piece rate sewing, the borrowed mourning dress. Each one carried inside it a set of legal and social conditions that most women accepted because they had no way of seeing anything different. Most of them, that is. Not all. There were women in this world, not many, not yet, but enough to matter, who had started looking at those conditions with a different kind of clarity. The particular clarity that comes from losing the thing that was supposed to protect you and finding yourself still upright, still breathing, still there. These women had begun asking questions the era found deeply uncomfortable, and they were starting slowly in ways that would take decades to fully play out to demand answers. The question worth asking right now isn't what these women suffered. Suffering is easy to acknowledge from a distance. The real question is what they understood, what they could see about the world they lived in that the world itself refused to look at, and what they did with that understanding when nearly every legal and social institution around them was arranged to make sure they did nothing with it at all. That is the world we're inside now. And the first thing we need to do is break apart the most powerful story the world ever told about itself. The spring mud in upstate New York smelled like iron and rot. The earth giving up its winter after months of being locked solid, releasing everything it had held in cold storage back into the wet air. It was the spring of 1848, and in a small town called Seneca Falls, a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton was writing a document that would scandalize the nation. She was doing it at a kitchen table, surrounded by children, in the middle of the ordinary chaos of a household that was, by the standards of the time, thriving. She had a husband, she had a home, and she was describing in careful and measured language the ways in which both of those facts had imprisoned her. Most people, when they think about women in the 1850s, carry a picture in their heads that goes something like this. Women were sheltered, protected, cherished by the men who provided for them, kept safe from the harsh realities of a brutal world. Marriage, in this version of the story, was a kind of benevolent arrangement. The woman gave domestic labour and companionship. The man gave security and legal standing. And both parties received something they couldn't have had on their own. The laws of coverture, which legally merged a woman's identity into her husband's upon marriage, weren't cruelty in this version of the story. They were protection. They were the legal architecture of care. This is the myth, and it needs to be broken carefully, because breaking it honestly means acknowledging that for some women, in some marriages, it was partially true. There were genuinely loving marriages in 1850s America. There were husbands who were fair-minded and decent, who would never have thought of exploiting the legal power the law handed them. The myth wasn't built entirely from nothing, but it's profoundly incomplete. And what it leaves out isn't a footnote, it's the entire structural reality of what happened to women the moment the protective arrangement failed, ended, or never began. Here's the truth that the myth conceals. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, not merely a custom or a tradition, but actual statute law in every American state, drawn directly from English common law, a married woman had no separate legal existence. Her property became her husband's property at the moment of marriage. No exceptions, no negotiations. Any wages she earned belonged to him. Any inheritance she received was under his control. Any contract she signed was legally void because she had no legal capacity to make agreements. She couldn't keep her own children if he decided to take them. She couldn't leave the marriage without his consent. Divorce required either an act of the legislature or proof of extreme cruelty. And the bar for extreme was set very high by judges who were, without exception, male. Now here's the part that the myth of protection has to answer for. This arrangement didn't become dangerous only in cases of abusive or wicked husbands. It became dangerous the moment the husband died, which in an era of cholera epidemics, industrial accidents, and the California gold rush, happened constantly and without warning. It became dangerous when the husband failed at business and his creditors came for everything, including his wife's inherited property. It became dangerous when he made ruinous financial decisions and she had no legal standing to intervene, object, or protect any part of what they'd built together. The protection that coverture supposedly offered was entirely contingent on the husband being alive, financially stable, physically present, and personally decent. Remove any one of those four conditions, and the protection vanished instantly, leaving the woman with nothing, no property, no legal standing, no recourse, no framework for her own survival. The Married Women's Property Act, passed in New York State in 1848, was the first crack in this wall. It was a modest crack. It allowed married women in New York to own property they'd inherited or received as gifts, separately from their husbands' estates. It didn't grant them full legal personhood. It didn't let them sign contracts or control their own wages. But it was the first time an American legislature had acknowledged in law that a married woman was a separate economic being with interests the law had some obligation to recognize. The women who'd spent years fighting for it, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who would stand up at Seneca Falls just weeks later, knew it wasn't enough. But they also knew it was a beginning. What the myth of protection also hides is the particular situation of women who had never married at all. For a spinster, the legal term was femme sole, a woman alone. The situation was in some ways paradoxically better and in other ways considerably worse than for a married woman. Better because a femme sole technically had more legal standing than a femme covert. A covered woman, a wife. An unmarried woman could, in most states, sign contracts, own property, and appear in court under her own name. She had legal personhood in a way her married counterpart did not. But the social cost of that standing was enormous, and it was deliberately structured to make those legal advantages feel like punishment rather than freedom. An unmarried woman past her mid-20s was an object of social concern at best, and pity or contempt at worst. The word spinster, drawn from the spinning that unmarried women were supposed to do since they had nothing better occupying their time, carried inside it a whole architecture of failure. She'd failed to attract a husband. She'd failed at the primary thing women were supposed to accomplish. She was, in the social vocabulary of the era, incomplete. And that detail has always stayed with me, that the system didn't need to force women into marriage. It simply made the alternative feel unbearable and then let women choose. This wasn't personal cruelty on any individual's part. It was a social mechanism with a very specific purpose, to make the legal advantages of single status feel so costly, so shameful, so deeply undesirable, that most women would accept the constraints of marriage without ever stopping to examine the choice they were making. Here's the most counterintuitive fact in this entire story. Widows, in many ways, had a better legal position than almost any other women in 1850s America. A widow had often inherited a portion of her husband's estate, a dower right, typically 1/3 of his real property for the duration of her life. She had the legal standing of a femme sole. She had social sympathy rather than contempt, at least for a while. And if she had any kind of economic foundation at all, she wasn't required to remarry. She could run a business, sign contracts, own land. She could, within limits that were still absurdly restrictive by any modern measure, function as an independent legal person. This is why widows were, proportionally, the most economically active women in 1850s America. They ran boarding houses and taverns, shops and small farms. They managed newspapers and printing operations after their husbands' deaths. They kept millinery shops and dressmaking businesses and laundries going. A widow who ran a successful enterprise wasn't invisible. She appeared in city directories, in tax records, in court documents. She was there, not as an exception or an oddity, but as a functioning economic actor whose existence the era recognised, even while quietly suggesting she'd be far better off if she would just marry again. The myth of protection, in the end, is the story that power tells about itself when it wants to look like care. It says, "We're keeping you safe." It says, "This is for your own good." What it doesn't say, what it can't afford to say and still hold its shape, is that the protection and the prison share the same walls. That the very arrangement meant to keep women safe made them, the moment it failed, utterly and completely exposed in ways that no amount of personal virtue, domestic skill, or sheer hard work could entirely prevent. Eliza Farnham knew this. She'd understood it before her husband died, and she felt it far more acutely after. The question she carried with her through the late 1840s and into the decade that would define her life wasn't whether the system was unjust. That was obvious. The question was what a woman could actually do about it. The answer she chose shocked her contemporaries, built her legend, and reveals more about the true nature of women's lives in 1850s America than almost any law book or census record ever could. But to understand her answer, you first have to understand who she was before she became the woman who dared to do the unthinkable. The November wind off the Hudson River smelled like wood smoke and cold, dark water moving steadily south. That particular mix of river air and early winter that tells you the season has turned for real and there's no going back. On the east bank of that river, inside the grey stone walls of Sing Sing State Prison, a 30-year-old woman named Eliza Farnham was standing in front of a room full of women who'd been told by the law and by society that they were beyond saving. She had brought a piano, and she was about to read them a novel. Eliza Wood Farnham was born in 1815 in the small village of Rensselaerville in upstate New York, the fourth of 5 children in a family that was, by any fair accounting, a difficult one. Her mother died when she was 4 years old. Her father, unable or unwilling to manage 5 young children on his own, sent Eliza and her siblings to live with relatives. The aunt who took her in wasn't cruel in any theatrical sense. She didn't beat the child or starve her, but she was cold in a way that left marks deeper than physical ones. She worked the girl hard, expected gratitude for the shelter given, and offered almost nothing in the way of warmth or any real encouragement of the mind. Eliza learned early what it meant to live in a household where your presence was a burden rather than a joy, and she learned it with the particular sharp attention of a child who has nothing else to study. She educated herself largely. The rural schools of upstate New York in the 1820s were uneven at best, and what formal instruction she received was supplemented urgently and hungrily by everything she could find to read. She developed opinions early, strong ones, unconventional ones, the kind that made her fascinating to certain people and deeply unsettling to others. She was drawn to phrenology, the belief that the shape of the human skull revealed the character of the mind within, which in the 1830s was considered a genuinely forward-thinking framework for understanding human psychology and individual difference. She was drawn to reform movements as well: temperance, the abolition of slavery, the growing question of prison reform that was beginning to occupy progressive minds on both sides of the Atlantic. In the late 1830s, she moved west to Illinois, young, unattached, looking for whatever came next. She lived on the prairie, and the experience marked her profoundly enough that she later wrote about it in a book called Life in Prairie Land, published in 1846. The prairie, she wrote, had a vastness to it that made the social conventions of eastern cities feel small and somewhat absurd. Out there, in the flat and open landscape of the Illinois frontier, She'd watched women work alongside men with an equality of labour that the parlours of New York City refused to acknowledge. She'd seen what women were actually capable of when the question wasn't what was proper, but what needed to be done. She married a man of restless intelligence and westward inclinations who would eventually make his name writing about California and Oregon. The marriage was, by the standards of the era, relatively fair-minded. Thomas respected Eliza's intellect, supported her work, and didn't demand the complete domestic submissiveness that most American husbands of the period considered their due. They had 3 children, though only one survived to adulthood. The weight of child mortality was not something that touched the Farnhams lightly. In 1844, through a combination of her own reputation in reform circles and the support of a prison reformer named John Edmonds, Eliza was appointed matron of the women's division at Sing Sing State Prison in Ossining, New York. She was 29 years old, and she stepped into an institution that operated on the straightforward premise that criminals were fundamentally degraded human beings who required not rehabilitation, but punishment, isolation, and silence. The women's ward at Sing Sing when Farnham arrived was a place of genuine bleakness. No books, no education, no music, no conversation, enforced silence at all hours, and the kind of monotonous labour, sewing and washing endlessly, that wore the mind down without offering it anything in return. Farnham changed everything she had the power to change, and fought for everything she didn't. She brought in books, including novels which the prison board considered dangerously frivolous. She arranged for a piano. She began reading aloud to the women in her care from works of literature, opening up the world of story and language to women who had been told their inner lives were forfeit at the prison gate. She brought teachers in. She tried to build a system of classification that distinguished between different kinds of offences rather than treating every woman convicted of anything as identically and permanently fallen. Her reasoning was radical for the time, and it still sounds surprisingly direct today. Women who had committed crimes had, in most cases, done so as a direct result of the conditions they'd lived in. Poverty, abandonment, lack of education, no real economic alternative, and abuse at the hands of men whose legal authority over them could not be questioned. You didn't rehabilitate such women by adding punishment to the suffering they already carried. You gave them what they'd never had: dignity, education, and a way of seeing a different kind of life as possible. The prison board disagreed. The newspapers disagreed. The male-authored moral framework of the era disagreed with nearly everything Eliza Farnham attempted at Sing Sing. And in 1848, the same year the Married Women's Property Act passed in New York, the same year Elizabeth Cady Stanton stood up at Seneca Falls, she was fired. The stated reason was insubordination and the introduction of pernicious novels. The real reason was that she had treated women as full human beings inside an institution designed to manage them as something considerably less. Then Thomas died. He was in San Francisco. He'd gone west, as so many men were going west, and in September of 1848, he died there of undisclosed illness. Leaving Eliza with a young son, a house she needed to hold on to, no income, and no husband to provide the legal standing that the law had decided in so many matters required a husband. She was a widow in her early 30s, no institutional position, a reputation the firing from Sing Sing had complicated, and a mind that was, if anything, clearer and more determined than it had ever been before. She looked at what she had. She looked at what the era offered a woman in her position, and she made a choice that left her contemporaries in something close to genuine speechlessness. She decided to go to California, not as a woman accompanying a man, not as someone's wife or someone's mother travelling west to find a husband's grave. She decided to go to California to bring other women with her, specifically educated and capable unmarried women, to a place where the catastrophically unbalanced sex ratio of the gold rush had created conditions in which women were genuinely scarce, genuinely needed, and might find more room to be fully human than the drawing rooms of New York were prepared to offer. What's remarkable is that she sat down and wrote it all out in a public circular, calmly, clearly, as if what she was proposing wasn't a direct challenge to every social rule her world had built. She published that circular in 1849, describing the plan in full. She proposed to gather a company of women of good character, educated, capable, willing, who would sail around Cape Horn and land in California, where opportunity waited that the crowded, convention-bound East had no interest in providing. The circular was reprinted in newspapers across the country. The response was not what she'd hoped. Some women wrote expressing genuine interest. Far more newspapers wrote to express contempt. The notion of women travelling alone, without male protection, across open water and into raw, barely settled territory. It violated every assumption the cult of true womanhood had spent decades carefully installing. In the end, Farnham sailed with only 3 women instead of the hundreds she had envisioned. The plan had been too large for the moment. The resistance was too organised. The fear of public opinion too powerful for most women to act against, however much they might have wanted to. But that she tried, that she looked at the rules of her world and decided to attempt something those rules specifically forbade, tells you something essential about who she was. It tells you something essential about what survival in the 1850s demanded of a woman who wanted to live on her own terms. Her story wasn't over, not by a long way. But we need to step back from it for a moment, because Eliza Farnham's experience as a woman without a husband in 1850s America, difficult, complicated, resisted at nearly every turn, was also, in crucial ways, a privileged one. There were women in this same decade whose experience of the exact same social conditions was shaped by forces she'd never faced. Forces that make her story look, in retrospect, like the lighter end of a very dark spectrum. The cornmeal was gritty between the fingers, coarse ground, the way it came when you'd been working the same millstone for too long without resetting it. In the kitchen of a farmhouse in southern Ohio in 1852, a free black woman named Sarah was making johnny cake for the 3rd time that week. Because it was cheap. Because it was filling. Because the winter had stretched on longer than anyone expected. She was 26 years old, recently arrived from Virginia by way of the network of routes and safe houses that people quietly called the Underground Railroad. Alone in a state that had given her freedom, but not much else. And she was thinking about a letter from her sister, still enslaved 200 miles to the south, without legal standing under any law, in any jurisdiction, anywhere in the United States. Sarah's name wasn't actually Sarah, or rather, we don't know what her name truly was, because the records of free black women in Ohio in the 1850s are sparse, partial, and frequently written down by white observers who recorded what they thought they heard rather than what was actually said. That fact itself tells us something about the history we're trying to piece back together. The women whose experience of living without a husband was most extreme and most legally absolute are also the women whose individual stories are hardest to recover. Because the same systems that shaped their lives were the systems that controlled documentation, literacy, and the right to tell your own story. What we can reconstruct from court documents, abolitionist literature, and the accounts that some formerly enslaved women were eventually able to give in their own words tells us this. For enslaved women in 1850s America, the category of woman without a husband worked in a completely different way than it did for white women. Not differently in a way that made it easier. differently in a way that exposed the raw mechanism behind all the social conventions white women were expected to navigate. Under American slavery, enslaved people could not legally marry. An enslaved person had no legal standing of any kind. Not as a feme soul, not as anything. They were property under the law, and property doesn't marry. Enslaved couples formed deep bonds, loving, committed relationships that they often marked with their own ceremonies and understood as fully and completely real. But the law recognized none of it. A slaveholder could sell a husband away from his wife and children with no more legal process than the sale of a horse or a piece of furniture, because the law described the transaction in exactly those terms. The phrase, woman without a husband, doesn't quite reach what enslaved women actually faced, because their condition wasn't merely the absence of marital protection, it was the absence of legal personhood entirely. Frederick Douglass, writing from his own experience of slavery in this same decade, described what the system did to the family bonds of enslaved people as a deliberate and calculated destruction, not a side effect, an intention. A woman who had no husband the law recognized, no children the law would protect, no property the law permitted her to hold. She had, in theory, no leverage, no resources, no social network capable of exerting any pressure on the system that held her. The destruction of family was a management strategy. And here is the perspective shift that most accounts of women in 1850 America still fail to make fully. The experience of enslaved and formerly enslaved women reveals something essential about the situation of all women without husbands in this period. It reveals the mechanism. It strips away the softening language of protection and care and shows the bare structure underneath. Legal non-existence is a tool of control. The degree of that non-existence varied. Catastrophically total for enslaved women, significantly severe for white women under coverture, somewhat reduced for widows with property, different again for indigenous women, whose own systems the American legal framework was actively dismantling. But the mechanism was the same across all those variations. Legal non-existence meant dependence. Dependence meant control, and control meant that whoever held legal standing held power over those who didn't. Free black women in northern cities occupied a position that combined the vulnerabilities of both racial status and female legal standing, in ways that stacked the disadvantages on top of each other. A free black woman in Boston or Philadelphia or Cincinnati in 1852 faced racial discrimination in employment that confined her to domestic service or laundry work regardless of her skills or education. She faced housing restrictions that limited where she could live. She faced the constant threat of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required all Americans, including Northerners, to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people, and which could be used to challenge her freedom if her status was considered even slightly ambiguous. And she carried all of this alongside the same absence of legal standing that white women faced under coverture, without the social sympathy that white widowhood sometimes attracted, and without the economic networks that white women of any class could reach through church communities, family ties, and mutual aid societies built around racial solidarity. Indigenous women present yet another layer of this shift. In the 1850s, the federal government was actively carrying out policies designed to force indigenous communities off their traditional lands and onto reservations, policies whose most direct human cost fell disproportionately on women and children, because women were so often the primary caretakers of the home, the food supply, and the children whose futures those policies were destroying. Within many indigenous nations, women had held specific economic roles, authority over the home and its contents, and standing within certain social and ceremonial structures that American law not only failed to recognize but actively worked against. The imposition of American property law onto indigenous communities didn't protect indigenous women. It stripped them of the rights they'd held within their own systems and replaced those rights with the same framework of female subordination that white American women were fighting to escape. The California gold rush opened yet another lens on all of this. In the mining camps and boom towns of early California, women arrived from Mexico, Chile, China, Hawaii, and from every corner of the United States, each carrying different legal statuses, different cultural frameworks, different relationships to the question of what a woman on her own could claim for herself. California women, those descended from Spanish and Mexican settlers, had come from a legal tradition that offered women somewhat stronger property rights than American common law did. The swift imposition of American legal frameworks after the Mexican-American War stripped them of protections their families had held for generations. Chinese women who arrived in California, most under conditions of severe exploitation, brought as contract labourers for domestic service and laundry work or worse, occupied a legal position so precarious that American law offered them essentially nothing. Mexican women who had owned land under Spanish land grants watched those claims challenged, litigated, and frequently taken outright by courts that refused to recognize the grants as legitimate. The story of women without husbands in 1850s. America is not, in other words, a single story. It's a collection of stories organized around one structural fact. In this era, legal standing was the prerequisite for nearly every other form of protection, and that standing was distributed unequally, conditionally, and in ways determined by race, class, national origin, and marital status all at once. The white widow with a boarding house had more standing than the free black seamstress. The free black seamstress had more than the enslaved woman 2 states south. The California landholder had more than the Chinese domestic worker, but none of them had what any white married man of ordinary means received automatically, from birth, by right of his maleness and his race. What this perspective reveals isn't a hierarchy of suffering to be ranked and assigned moral weight. What it reveals is the architecture of the system. The way legal non-existence operated as a mechanism that touched every woman of every race and class and origin, but touched them differently, depending on how many other disadvantages the system had already arranged against them. Think about that for a moment, because understanding this architecture is exactly what makes it possible to understand why the women who began to challenge it were so insistent and so specific in what they demanded. They weren't asking for kindness, they were asking for legal standing, and they understood with a clarity the era found genuinely threatening that legal standing was the foundation everything else was built on. As the decade wore on, the pressure created by the absence of that foundation began producing consequences that even the people who'd built the system couldn't entirely look away from. Because the situation wasn't just unjust, it was becoming, in ways that were growing harder to ignore, dangerous. The needle went through the thin fabric, pulled the thread, went through again. In a garret room above a warehouse on Worth Street in Lower Manhattan, a woman named Mary worked by the light of a single candle stub, sewing the seam on a shirt that a merchant had contracted out through a middleman for 5 cents per dozen completed shirts. She'd been sewing since 6 in the morning. It was now past 10 at night. At this pace, working 12 to 14 hours a day, she'd earn approximately $1.25 for the week. Less if the merchant decided to dock her for uneven stitching, which he did periodically and without any warning. Her rent was $1.50. She was short on the food she needed to keep sewing, and short on candles to keep working in the dark. The situation for women workers in 1850s American cities wasn't merely difficult. By the middle of the decade, it was becoming genuinely desperate, and the conditions that had produced that desperation weren't accidental. They were the direct result of economic decisions made by people who benefited from cheap female labour and who had arranged both the law and the social vocabulary to make those arrangements seem perfectly natural. The piece rate sewing system, what people at the time called the slop trade, or simply sweated labour, was the primary form of employment available to women without husbands in American cities during the 1840s and 1850s. It ran on a simple and efficient principle: give fabric to women working in their own rooms, pay them per finished piece, and eliminate the need to provide a workplace, cover heating or lighting, guarantee any minimum wage, offer any consistency of work, or accept any legal responsibility for the workers' well-being. The women provided everything: the space, the tools, the fuel, the light, and received in return a rate set entirely by the merchant, subject to change without notice, with no recourse if it dropped and no leverage whatsoever. In New York City in the early 1850s, piece rate sewing wages had already fallen considerably from what they'd been a decade before, because the supply of women desperate enough to take any wage had grown enormously. Immigration from Ireland and Germany, following the famines and failed revolutions of the 1840s, had added vast numbers of women to the labour pool. Women who'd arrived alone, women whose male relatives had died on the crossing, women who'd discovered that the streets of America were not quite as promising as the stories had suggested. They needed work, any work, and the merchants who controlled the piece rate system understood very clearly what any work meant in terms of their power to set the terms. The arithmetic of female survival within the system wasn't merely tight. In many cases it was mathematically impossible. A woman sewing shirts for 5 cents a dozen, working the longest hours her body could manage, might produce 4 to 6 dozen shirts in a full week. That was 20 to 30 cents a day. Her room cost between $1.50 and $2.50 per week. Food, the bare minimum needed to keep working, cost at least 50 cents a week in a city where prices had been steadily rising. She couldn't afford both rent and food on a seamstress's wages. Something had to give. And in the 1850s, the things that gave were entirely predictable. The first was health. The combination of inadequate food, inadequate heat, and the particular strain of long-hour sewing, hunched over fine work in failing light, produced a pattern of illness among urban seamstresses that reformers and journalists began documenting with growing alarm. Tuberculosis moved steadily through the crowded boarding houses and garret rooms where women sewed and slept and cooked. Eye damage and musculoskeletal injury were nearly universal. Women who arrived in the city young and capable were visibly worn down within a few years of entering the trade. The popular press ran the occasional sentimental piece about the pale seamstress, the ghostly figure hunched over her needle in the candlelight, and then went back to buying the shirts her labour had produced. The second thing that gave was social convention. A woman who couldn't cover food and rent on legal wages had, in many cases, only one other option available to her. Prostitution in American cities in the 1850s wasn't a hidden underworld tucked away from respectable sight. In New York City alone, contemporary estimates put the number of women involved somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000. Estimates that historians now believe significantly undercounted the women engaged in occasional or part-time work as a supplement to wages that couldn't cover survival. These were women in desperate circumstances making desperate calculations, and the system that had placed them in those circumstances was perfectly comfortable, looking away from what those circumstances produced. What struck the reformers who tried to document these situations was how quickly the descent happened. A woman could arrive in New York City with references, with skills, with genuine willingness to work, and find herself inside a single year in conditions that seemed impossible to have reached so fast. The steps were small, and they followed each other with terrible logic. Wages fell below the cost of survival. She fell behind on rent. She was removed from her room. Without a fixed address, she lost her position in the piece rate system because merchants wanted a reliable place to deliver fabric and collect finished work. Without wages, she couldn't pay for another room. The next available option was a shared space in a worse part of the city, and the step after that had a name that polite vocabulary preferred not to speak aloud. In the textile factories, particularly the mills of New England, which had built an entire mythology in the 1840s around the wholesome Lowell girls at their looms, conditions had also been quietly deteriorating. The original Lowell system, developed in the 1820s and 1830s, had made a genuine effort to reassure parents that their daughters were safe working in the factories. Supervised boarding houses, educational programs, cultural events, long hours but structured ones. By the early 1850s, that framework was unravelling. Competition from cheaper British textiles and from new mills opening in the south was pushing manufacturers to cut costs wherever they could. Speed-ups, assigning workers more looms to tend, with no additional pay, became standard practice. Hours stretched longer. Boarding house oversight grew lax. The Lowell girls of the old mythology were being replaced by Irish immigrant women who had fewer choices and far less institutional support. In 1845, a coalition of Lowell mill workers had organised the Female Labour Reform Association, one of the earliest female labour organisations in American history. They petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to limit the working day to 10 hours. The legislature held a public hearing, one of the first times working women had been formally invited to testify about their labour conditions before an American legislative body. The committee listened, deliberated, and concluded that the petition wasn't supported by sufficient evidence. The workers went back to their looms. What was becoming visible to anyone paying close attention was a system under intensifying pressure at every point where it touched women who had no male provider to fall back on. Widows, unmarried women, abandoned wives, and immigrant women without family networks. They made up the growing female workforce of American cities, and they were being squeezed from both sides at once, wages falling, cost of survival rising, and the law still provided essentially no mechanism for a woman to demand, enforce, or defend her right to anything. No minimum wage, no right to organise that would be genuinely enforced, no recourse against an employer who cheated her or dismissed her without cause, no legal standing in most of the disputes that determined whether she ate that week or didn't. The pressure was becoming hard to ignore, even for people who benefited directly from the system, not because they cared deeply about the seamstresses, not all of them, not exactly, but because visible, widespread desperation was starting to generate social instability in ways that a single pale figure in a newspaper illustration had never quite managed to convey. The municipal infrastructure of American cities in the 1850s was wholly unprepared for the scale of female poverty the decade produced. Almshouses, the era's version of last resort shelters, had been built for the elderly and the infirm, not for women temporarily caught between a week's wages and a rent payment. The poorhouses of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston were filling steadily through the decade with women who had miscalculated their margin by a few cents, and discovered that a few cents was the entire difference between a room and no room at all. Once you were out of a room, without an address, without a reference from a respectable landlady, re-entering the piece rate system was close to impossible. The trap closed quickly, and the way out was genuinely hard to find. What the decade also produced, in response to this visible and growing strain, was the charitable reform movement, a network of voluntary associations largely organised and run by middle-class women dedicated to addressing the conditions of their poorer sisters. The New York Female Moral Reform Society, founded in 1834, had spent the late 1830s and 1840s carefully documenting conditions for women in the city and pushing for precisely the legal and economic changes that would have actually addressed the root of the problem. These women understood the mechanism clearly. The challenge was persuading a legislature composed entirely of men and an economic system that was profiting from cheap female labour to do anything meaningful about it. The ledger books smelled of old paper and the dry, particular dust of a counting room, the smell of money carefully organised and carefully hidden. In the offices of a textile merchant on Broadway in New York City in 1853, the columns added up to a substantial profit. The column of wages paid to piece-rate sewers was low. It had been deliberately kept low. This was not an accident. The economic exploitation of women without husbands in 1850s, America wasn't a random outcome of market forces operating without intention or design. It was, to a significant degree, the deliberate product of legal and social arrangements that specific economic interests had strong reasons to maintain, and that those interests used considerable political influence to preserve. Understanding who benefited from women's legal non-existence isn't a conspiracy theory, it's basic economic history. Start with the most fundamental fact. Under the wage system of the 1850s, women earned across all occupations and industries approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of what men earned for equivalent work. This wasn't because women's work was less productive. In piece-rate manufacturing, output could be measured precisely, and it often was. The wage gap existed because women, particularly those without husbands, had almost no bargaining power, and the legal and social structure had been built specifically to ensure they wouldn't. A woman who earned 1/3 of a man's wages for the same work was, from an employer's perspective, an extraordinary asset. She cost less. She had fewer legal protections. She couldn't sue for back wages in most jurisdictions without a male guardian appearing in court on her behalf. She couldn't form a legal labour organisation with the same standing that emerging male unions were beginning to claim. And if she complained too loudly, she could be dismissed without cause and replaced almost immediately. From a labour pool that, thanks to immigration and the steady movement of desperate women from rural areas, was large and growing larger every year. The economics of female labour weren't brutal in spite of how the law treated women. They were brutal because of it. The boarding house economy deserves particular attention here, because it represents one of the more subtle mechanisms by which the labour of women without husbands was quietly and systematically extracted. The boarding house was the primary housing solution for single women in American cities during this period, and it was also frequently operated by women. At first that might sound encouraging, women providing shelter for other women, building an economic network outside of male control, and in some ways, it was. Widows who ran boarding houses had access to one of the most stable forms of female self-employment available in the era. But the boarding house system also required something that no one openly acknowledged. It required that someone, usually the landlady, sometimes her daughters, sometimes other female residents who traded labour for reduced rent, perform enormous quantities of domestic work that was never counted as economic production. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, fire building, hauling water. All of it done by women every day in boarding houses across the country. And none of it appeared in any account book with a wage attached. It was simply expected. It was, in the vocabulary of the era, women's natural work, which meant it was work that didn't need to be paid for because it was natural. The domestic service industry operated on the same logic, at a larger scale. Household servants in the 1850s typically received room and board in addition to wages, which had the practical effect of binding them to a specific employer's home with a financial dependency that made organising or leaving genuinely difficult. Their wages, when they existed, were low. Their hours were effectively unlimited. A domestic servant was available to the household from before breakfast until the last lamp was extinguished at night, with minimal time off and no real boundary between work and personal life, because the two occupied the same space, and their legal standing in disputes with employers was essentially nothing. The textile and garment industries depended on this structure at a national scale. By 1850, the ready-to-wear clothing industry in the United States, the production of standardized garments for sale, rather than custom work for individual clients, was a substantial and rapidly expanding business, and it was built almost entirely on piece-rate female labour. The economic model functioned precisely because women had no legal mechanism to demand better wages, and because the combination of social shame attached to female poverty and the legal barriers to collective female action kept the supply of cheap labour reliably large. Remove either of those factors, give women meaningful recourse in wage disputes, or remove the social penalties that made female poverty shameful rather than a legitimate grievance, and the profit margins that made the whole industry viable would have had to come from somewhere else. The political economy of this situation was not invisible to the people operating inside it. Male labour organisers in the 1840s and 1850s were often quite direct about what they saw as the core problem. Women in the workforce, they argued, drove down wages for everyone. The solution they typically proposed wasn't better pay for women. It was the removal of women from the workforce entirely, and their return to the domestic sphere, where their labour would once again be invisible, unpaid, and no longer in competition with male workers. This analysis was self-serving, obviously, but it was also structurally accurate in one sense. Women working at 1/3 of men's wages did create downward pressure on what everyone earned. What male labour organisers carefully avoided saying was that the real solution was equal wages for women, because equal wages would have meant acknowledging women as full economic actors. And that was precisely what the entire legal and social apparatus of the era was organised to prevent. The connection to the legal system was direct and entirely intentional. Coverture benefited employers who could hire married women and have their wages paid directly to their husbands, with the wives having no legal standing to object. The refusal to grant women full legal personhood meant female workers couldn't sign enforceable contracts, couldn't sue for violations, and couldn't form legally recognised unions. The social penalties attached to female independence meant that women who tried to organise faced not just employer retaliation, but community disapproval, the accusation that they were unfeminine, out of place, stepping outside their natural role in ways that made them unfit as wives and mothers, and therefore, in the eyes of the era, as women. What's remarkable is that the system didn't need to be secretly coordinated to function as though it had been, because every piece of it reinforced every other piece, and the people benefiting from it had every reason to leave the questions unasked. The system was not a monolithic conspiracy with a single directing mind. It was something more complicated, and in some ways more troubling, a collection of mutually reinforcing arrangements, legal, economic, social and religious, that served the interests of those who benefited from female dependence, and that had been in place long enough to look like nature rather than policy. The people who maintained it weren't for the most part consciously cruel. They were people operating inside a framework that rewarded them for not asking certain questions. The seamstress in the garret room was not a secret. Her conditions were documented in newspapers and government reports. The connection between those conditions and the legal framework that made them possible was not hidden from view. It was simply convenient to ignore. And yet some people didn't ignore it. Some people looked at the whole arrangement, the piece rate wages, the legal non-existence, the unpaid boarding house labour, the social shame attached to female poverty, and saw not nature, but policy. Not the inevitable order of things, but a specific set of choices that could in principle be made differently. These were the people who were beginning in the 1850s to do something about it, and the resistance they built, operating entirely from within a system designed to prevent exactly that kind of resistance, is one of the most quietly remarkable stories of American persistence in the entire 19th century. The manufacturing economy's dependence on female labour extended well beyond the needle trades. In the growing food processing industry, in paper-making mills, in bookbinding workshops, in the tobacco factories of the mid-Atlantic states, women were employed in large numbers, at rates far below those paid to men doing equivalent work. The arguments employers offered for the difference were remarkably consistent and remarkably cynical. Women were less physically strong than men, irrelevant in most of these industries, where strength wasn't the determining factor. Women's earnings were naturally supplementary to a male income, which simply wasn't true for the large numbers of women who had no male income to supplement. Women had no family obligations, also untrue, and in any case an argument that would logically have supported higher wages for women raising families alone, not lower ones. The invisible hand of the market in this particular instance was doing exactly what it was built to do, finding the cheapest available labour and paying precisely what it needed to pay to get the work done. The cheapest available labour in 1850s, America was female labour, precisely because the legal and social structure had been arranged to prevent women from asking for more. The low wages weren't natural, they weren't inevitable, they weren't the simple outcome of supply and demand working freely. They were subsidised by law, and somewhere in a garret room on Worth Street, a needle was still going through thin fabric, pulling thread, going through again, while a ledger on Broadway recorded exactly how much that silence was worth. The salt air off San Francisco Bay smelled nothing like New York. It was sharper, colder, laced with the particular smell of a harbour town still half raw, fresh-cut lumber and ship tar and the cooking smoke of 1,000 fires rising from a city still mostly built of wood. Eliza Farnham stood on the deck of the ship that had carried her around Cape Horn, looked out at the bay in 1849 and saw something that most people coming to California weren't looking for. Not gold. Possibility. She'd arrived with 3 women instead of the 100 she'd envisioned. The plan had been too large for the moment, the resistance too organised, the era not quite ready for the scale of what she'd imagined. But she was here, and being here, in a place still forming itself, still deciding what it was going to be, felt different from New York in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. California in 1849 was chaotic and difficult and genuinely dangerous. It was also thrilling in the specific way that only places without fully settled rules can be. The laws were being written as people went. Social conventions were being worked out in real time, and women, particularly those with skills, intelligence and a willingness to work, were in extraordinary demand. Eliza found a farm in the Santa Cruz Mountains, about 60 miles south of San Francisco, and got to work. She grew vegetables, kept animals, and eventually started writing again, working on the book that would become California Indoors and Out, published in 1856. She described her years in the state with a directness and dry humour that her contemporaries found either charming or deeply unsettling, depending on their disposition. She wasn't describing a paradise. She was describing a place where the ordinary rules had been loosened just enough to let a woman breathe, and what a woman could do with a lungful of that air. Back east, the women who'd been fighting the system had been doing so for years without waiting for California's particular freedoms. The Lowell Mill Workers Female Labour Reform Association of 1845 was one point in a growing network of female organising that was, by the early 1850s, beginning to connect across industries and across state lines. In New York, seamstresses were attempting to form mutual aid societies, not quite labour unions because the legal standing for female unions was still unclear, but organisations that could pool resources, share information about which employers paid fairly and which ones cheated on piece rates, and offer some minimal support to members who fell ill or lost their positions. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 was the most widely known expression of this organising energy. But it wasn't the only one, and it was in some ways the least typical, because Seneca Falls was organised by and for relatively privileged women. Women who had the education, the social connections, and the time to draft a Declaration of Sentiments modelled on the Declaration of Independence and debate it in a church in upstate New York for 2 full days. The seamstresses on Worth Street and the mill workers in Lowell were doing something different, and in some ways, something more immediately dangerous. They were demanding, in the face of employer retaliation and open public contempt, that their labour be valued at something closer to its actual worth. The 10-hour-day movement for female textile workers pressed on through the 1850s, despite the Massachusetts legislature's rebuff in 1845. In New Hampshire in 1847, a 10-hour law had passed, the first of its kind in the nation. In Pennsylvania, women workers testified before the state legislature with a directness that visibly surprised observers who had expected female petitioners to be quiet and deferential. They weren't. They were exhausted. They were underpaid, and they'd been told too many times that their conditions were their own fault for not having husbands. They were done being deferential. The women who ran their own businesses, the widows and the femme souls who had found, in the narrow space between marriage and destitution, a sliver of economic ground to stand on, were engaged in their own form of resistance simply by existing and carrying on. The boarding house landladies who kept their establishments running through the decade's financial instabilities, who negotiated with suppliers, managed difficult borders, and dealt with tax collectors and city inspectors without a husband's name on any of the paperwork. They were demonstrating daily and practically that the argument for female legal non-existence wasn't grounded in any real incapacity on women's part. It was grounded in the preferences of the people who held legal power. California, for all its roughness, was proving this on a much larger scale. Women in the gold rush state, including women of colour, including immigrants, including women whose legal standing in the East had been essentially nothing, were running profitable businesses, holding property, negotiating contracts, and making legal claims in California courts with a consistency and a success rate that the more settled eastern states found quietly uncomfortable. The California Constitution of 1849 had included a provision, drawn from Mexican legal tradition, giving married women the right to hold separate property, a protection more substantial than anything New York's 1848 Act had managed. When Eastern newspapers noted this fact, as they occasionally did, the implication beneath the surface was hard to miss. The argument that women couldn't handle property rights was not holding up under the weight of actual evidence. Eliza Farnham was watching all of this and writing about it with her characteristic precision. Her California years weren't easy. The farm demanded hard physical labour. The frontier setting was simultaneously more free and more demanding than anything she'd known back east. But she was thinking and writing and slowly building the arguments that would eventually take shape in a book called Woman and Her Era, published in 1864, the year of her death. It was a philosophical argument that women were not merely equal to men but morally and spiritually superior, and that raising women to full legal and social standing was therefore not merely a matter of fairness, but a matter of genuine human progress. The argument sounds unusual to modern ears, and strategically it had its limits, because grounding women's rights in female moral superiority made those rights contingent on women actually being morally superior, which is a fragile foundation to build on. But in the context of the 1850s, when every argument for keeping women out of public life rested on the premise that they were less rational, less capable, less suited for anything beyond the domestic sphere, the counter-argument that women were in fact better equipped for moral leadership was genuinely radical. It flipped the terms of the debate entirely. It said, "The very qualities you've been using to exclude us are our greatest strengths." What all of these acts of resistance had in common: Farnham's California venture, the mill workers' petitions, the seamstresses' mutual aid societies, the widows quietly managing their own affairs, the property rights activists circulating their pamphlets, was a refusal to accept the premise, a refusal to agree that a woman without a husband was, by definition, incomplete, incapable, in need of management rather than legal standing. This refusal wasn't always articulate, it wasn't always organised or strategic or immediately successful, but it was persistent, and it was everywhere, and it was laying the groundwork for changes that would take decades to arrive, but that, once they came, would arrive with the force of everything that had been quietly building beneath the surface. The mutual aid societies that women built in the 1840s and 1850s were more sophisticated than the historical record typically acknowledges. Operating outside the formal legal framework that would have required male officers to make them officially viable, these organisations developed internal structures built on trust and community accountability rather than contract. They kept records of members in good standing. They distributed relief in cases of illness or sudden job loss. They maintained informal lists of employers who paid honestly versus those who routinely cheated on piece rates. And they created networks of shared information that gave individual women access to collective knowledge they couldn't have gathered alone. The structure wasn't as legally solid as a formal union would have been, but it was what was available, and the women who built it made it work. The gold rush created, almost by accident, the conditions for an experiment in female economic agency that the more settled East wasn't yet prepared to allow. Women who arrived in California in the early 1850s, whether through organised ventures like Farnham's small company, or as wives travelling with prospecting husbands, or as independent entrepreneurs who'd simply calculated that a place with almost no women and enormous demand for cooking, laundering and nursing was a place where a woman's skills had real value, found themselves inside an economy that hadn't yet decided, at the level of daily practice, what women were allowed to do. Many of them did everything, and many of them got paid for it, in ways that women back in New York or Boston couldn't have begun to imagine. The phone notification arrives at 2 a.m, a message from the gig platform explaining that the algorithm has recalculated rates and the per-delivery payment has been reduced by 12%, effective immediately, with no option to negotiate and no mechanism to contest. The driver sets the phone face down on the nightstand and stares at the ceiling, doing math that doesn't add up. The way it never quite adds up anymore. She's 41. She doesn't have a husband. She has a lease, a car payment, a kid in middle school, and a working week of 60-plus hours that the platform classifies as independent contracting rather than employment, which means no overtime, no benefits, no minimum wage floor, no unemployment insurance if the algorithm changes again tomorrow in a way that makes her route unprofitable. The connection between this moment and the garret room on Worth Street where Mary sewed shirts for 5 cents a dozen is not a metaphor. It's structural. The legal arrangement that allowed textile merchants in 1850s America to pay women piece rates below survival wages without consequence was built on the same principle, that allows gig economy platforms today to classify workers as independent contractors rather than employees. The designation removes legal obligations to the workers while keeping all the economic benefits of their labour. The workers carry all the risk. The company takes all the upside. The legal category, pieceworker, then independent contractor now, is the mechanism. And the mechanism hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think. American women without husbands are still, in the 2020s, statistically among the most economically vulnerable people in the country. Women over 65 living alone have poverty rates significantly higher than men of the same age living alone, and higher than married couples at any age. Single mothers, the largest category of women without husbands in modern America, have poverty rates that consistently exceed those of every other family structure. Women who divorce in middle age or later face what researchers call grey divorce poverty, a pattern in which men's financial situations tend to improve after separation and women's deteriorate, a direct result of the accumulated inequalities of marriages in which a woman's career was subordinated to her husband's and her domestic labour was never counted as a financial contribution. The credit system is a modern version of the same structural problem. For most of American history, until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, women couldn't get credit cards or mortgages in their own names. A single woman applying for a home loan was routinely turned away on the grounds that her income was unreliable, because she might get married and stop working, or might have children and stop working, or was simply a woman, and therefore a worse credit risk by definition. The 1974 Act changed the formal law. The informal practices took considerably longer to shift, and some economists and historians argue they haven't shifted entirely. Women still face documented discrimination in mortgage lending, business loan approval, and investment funding. The same structural exclusions of the earlier era, wearing different legal clothing. Financial independence for women, the ability to earn, hold, invest, and control money without reference to a husband, is still far from universal. The gender wage gap in the mid-2020s sits at roughly 80 to 83 cents on the dollar for full-time workers, depending on how you measure it. The gap is wider for women of colour, wider still in certain industries, and widest of all for women who step out of the workforce for caregiving, for the domestic labour that in the 1850s was entirely unpaid and invisible, and that today is still largely underpaid and invisible to the economic systems that assign value to human effort. Social security benefits, calculated on lifetime earnings, are lower for women who spent years as primary caregivers. Retirement savings are lower. Pension access is lower. The woman who spends her working years inside the domestic economy, not as a leisure choice, but as a practical response to who does the caregiving in most American families, arrives at old age having produced enormous amounts of essential work that the economy never figured out how to count. The housing crisis has a particular dimension for women that rarely gets named directly. Single women are the fastest growing category of first-time homebuyers in the United States. They buy homes at a higher rate than single men, which sounds like progress, until you look more closely at what they're buying and where. Single women are more likely to purchase in lower-cost markets, more likely to buy homes that appreciate below average, more likely to settle in neighbourhoods with fewer resources because their incomes still don't stretch as far as men's, and they're more vulnerable to the foreclosure crises that periodically move through those same lower-cost areas. The woman buying the best home her income can reach in a market that has priced her out of the more stable neighbourhoods. At a structural level, she's doing something that would have been completely recognisable to the widow in 1853 trying to hold on to property in a legal framework that didn't want her to succeed. There's a specific question that the 1850s story puts in front of us today. In an era when the formal legal exclusions have been removed, when women can sign contracts, own property, open accounts, access credit, and sue for back wages. Why does the economic vulnerability persist? The answer the historical record suggests is this. Legal standing is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. Formal equality in the law doesn't automatically produce material equality in life if the structures built during the era of formal inequality are still standing. The wage gap isn't illegal, but it exists. Credit discrimination is illegal, but it persists. The domestic labour that falls disproportionately on women doesn't register in gross domestic product, doesn't count toward retirement benefits, doesn't appear in any standard measure of economic output. Not because the law requires that invisibility, but because the frameworks we use to measure and value economic activity were designed when that labour was simply assumed to be part of being a woman. And those frameworks haven't been rebuilt to see it differently. The women of 1850s America who were fighting for legal standing understood something still worth understanding today. Formal equality is the floor, not the ceiling. The Married Women's Property Act of 1848 gave women in New York the right to hold property. It didn't alter the social expectation that women would use that right only within limits men approved of. The right to vote, finally achieved in 1920, gave women a political voice. It didn't immediately change the economic structures that kept that voice from translating into economic power. Each formal right opened the door a little further, but walking fully through it required dismantling things that laws don't easily touch. Assumptions about whose labour counts, whose time is valuable, whose economic decisions deserve respect, and who receives the benefit of the doubt. Eliza Farnham would recognise the shape of this argument. She spent her adult life working in the gap between formal impossibility and practical reality, doing things the law said she couldn't do, claiming standing the law hadn't granted, insisting on the full scope of her own personhood in a framework that only wanted to recognise part of it. The specific legal barriers she faced are gone, but the orientation of the argument remains. The insistence that women's full economic and legal personhood is not a favour extended by a generous society, but a basic condition of human dignity. That argument is ongoing. It is in some form the same argument that Mary Wollstonecraft started, that Elizabeth Cady Stanton continued, that the seamstresses on Worth Street embodied without quite having the language to name it. It's the argument Eliza Farnham sat down to write in a cold California farmhouse in the 1850s, by the light of a candle that burned to the stub and was then quietly replaced with another one. The social security system, established in 1935, carries the imprint of the 1850s in ways most Americans never stop to consider. It was designed around a model of the male breadwinner and the female dependent, a model in which a wife's benefit came primarily through her husband's contribution record, and in which her own work history, if she had interrupted it for caregiving, was substantially discounted. The women of the 1850s who argued that domestic labour was real labour, that raising children who became productive members of society was a genuine economic contribution. Those women were not wrong. Their argument was simply lost repeatedly in the shuffle of more pressing seeming concerns. But before we understand the full scope of what changed and what didn't, we need to sit with the great unresolved question that historians and scholars have been carefully turning over for more than a century. Because the story of women without husbands in 1850s America doesn't have a clean moral. It has several competing interpretations, each supported by real evidence, each telling a slightly different story about power and choice, and what it means to live inside a system you didn't design. The archive smells the way all archives smell, that dry, faintly sweet smell of old paper slowly giving up its acids, the smell of words preserved past the lives of the people who wrote them. In the reading room of a major research library, two historians are sitting at the same table, working from the same set of primary sources. The letters and diaries, the court records and census documents of women in 1850s America. And they're reaching different conclusions. They're both right about some things. Neither is entirely right about everything. This is the nature of the great debate. The central question scholars have been arguing about for decades, with renewed energy since the 1970s, when women's history became a serious academic discipline, is this. How much agency did women without husbands in 1850s America actually have? Was this an era of fundamental oppression in which women's lives were severely constrained by a system built without their interests in mind? Or was it an era of more varied female experience, in which women exercised real degrees of choice, built meaningful institutions, and created lives of genuine autonomy within and around the formal restrictions the law imposed? The historian who argues for oppression has a powerful case. The legal framework of coverture was genuinely severe. The exploitation of female labour was real and carefully documented. The social penalties for stepping outside prescribed roles were substantial and consistent. The volume of evidence from women's own letters, diaries, and personal testimony about the conditions of their lives makes it very hard to argue that the system wasn't causing genuine harm to large numbers of women. The widow who lost her farm, the seamstress who couldn't cover her rent, the abandoned wife with no legal mechanism to compel her husband's financial support. These weren't exceptional cases. They were the predictable outcomes of a system operating exactly as it had been designed to operate. But the historian who argues for complexity has an equally powerful case. The historical record of women without husbands in this era is not only a record of hardship, it's a record of extraordinary resourcefulness, of institution building, of economic activity that the formal legal framework tried to suppress but couldn't entirely prevent. Women ran businesses, accumulated property, organised labour movements, published newspapers and books, travelled alone to California, filed legal claims, won legal cases. Women built mutual aid networks outside the formal economy that provided real, material support to members in crisis. The formal barriers were real, and these things happened anyway, which tells you something essential about the women who made them happen. One of the most debated specific questions is about the experience of working-class women versus women of the middle class, and whether those experiences are different enough to require entirely separate analyses. The feminist historians of the 1970s and 1980s were sometimes criticised for writing a women's history that was, in practice, a white middle-class women's history. One that took the experience of women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Eliza Farnham as representative, when in fact their relationship to the era's constraints was shaped profoundly by race and class in ways the seamstress on Worth Street or the free black woman in Ohio would not recognise as her own story. This isn't merely an academic distinction. It matters for how we understand what was actually at stake in the debates about women's rights that were building through the 1850s. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton argued for women's suffrage, she was arguing for the political voice of white women, of her particular class, and she made, at various points, arguments that were explicitly hierarchical about whose suffrage was more urgent or more deserved, arguments that prioritized the claims of educated white women over those of black men recently freed from enslavement. The history of the suffrage movement is a history of strategic alliances and strategic betrayals, and the question of who the movement was truly for is not settled simply by noting that it eventually produced the 19th Amendment. There's also a serious scholarly debate about the degree to which women in the 1850s understood themselves as oppressed in the terms we'd use today. A woman who had grown up inside the cult of true womanhood, taught from childhood that her natural place was the home, that her highest virtue was deference to her husband's authority, that female ambition was a kind of deformity, might genuinely experience legal coverture not as oppression, but as the natural order of things, and if she experienced it as natural, the question of whether she was oppressed becomes complicated in ways that history and political theory haven't fully resolved. Did women in the 1850s who didn't resist the system hold back because they couldn't, or because they genuinely absorbed its premises? The evidence suggests that both things were true simultaneously for different women, and sometimes for the same woman at different moments in her life. The seamstress who was too exhausted to attend a labour meeting after 16 hours of sewing wasn't staying away because she'd internalized her oppression. She was staying away because she was exhausted. The plantation mistress who defended slavery and the social hierarchy that placed her above enslaved women while placing her beneath her husband was doing something more complicated, expressing genuine convictions shaped by the conditions of her life and the ideological framework she'd grown up inside. The debate about complicity in women's history is one of the most charged conversations in the field. To what degree were women who accepted and enforced the rules of their era's gender system complicit in that system's harms? To what degree were those same women acting under compulsion, making the best choices available to them within extremely narrow circumstances? The answer depends heavily on which woman you're looking at and what options were actually available to her. Which brings us back, always, to the intersections of race and class and geography that the debate sometimes flattens when it reaches for easy generalizations. What historians broadly agree on is this: the 1850s were a genuine turning point. The decade brought together several forces at once: the early women's rights movement, the labour organising of factory workers, the expansion of female education, the gold rush disruption of gender ratios, the growing and undeniable visibility of female poverty in cities, and those forces began to crack the foundations of the system. Not to bring it down, that would take decades more, but to make the cracks visible, to make it increasingly difficult to claim, with any real conviction, that the arrangement was natural, inevitable, and operating in women's own best interest. Eliza Farnham's contribution to this turning point wasn't primarily legal or political. She didn't win elections. She didn't pass legislation. What she did was write and speak and live in a way that demonstrated, visibly, publicly, in the documented record, that the premises the system rested on were false, that women could manage farms and write books and cross oceans and run institutions without men directing them, that the legal framework claiming otherwise wasn't a description of reality, it was a prescription for it. And descriptions and prescriptions are different things. Only one of them can be changed. The question she didn't live to see answered is whether the change, when it finally came, would be deep enough, whether it would touch the structure or only the surface. That question is still being answered. There's also an ongoing debate about the cult of true womanhood itself, about whether it was primarily a mechanism of control or a genuine cultural value system that women in the era found meaningful and used strategically. Some historians argue that the emphasis on female moral authority, the insistence that the domestic sphere was not merely separate from public life but superior to it, actually gave women in the 1850s a cultural standing they deployed with real skill and real effect. The temperance movement, the abolition movement, the prison reform work that Eliza Farnham gave years of her life to. All of these were driven in large part by women who used the moral authority their era attributed to femininity as a form of leverage for public action. The cult of true womanhood was a cage, but in the hands of skilled operators, it was also a set of keys. The most honest answer to the great debate is that both things were true at the same time. The era severely constrained women's lives, and women living inside those constraints created remarkable things. The constraint and the creation weren't separate facts. The creation happened in response to the constraint, around its edges, through its gaps, in the spaces the system had forgotten to close off. Understanding this doesn't require choosing between a story of victimhood and a story of triumph. It requires holding both, because the history requires it. The smell of ink was in the air of the New York State Assembly chamber in Albany on the morning in April 1848, when the Married Women's Property Act was formally signed into law. That particular sharp, metallic smell of freshly printed legislation, of words being given force. The bill had been in the works for 12 years, introduced, rejected, reintroduced, amended, argued over, lobbied for by women's rights advocates and by the Dutch community in New York, which had legal traditions of female property holding that predated English common law entirely. When it finally passed, it was modest. It allowed women to hold, separately and in their own names, property inherited or received as a gift. It didn't allow them to sign contracts. It didn't give them control of their own earnings. It was a crack, not a door. But cracks, given time and the right pressure, become something more. The New York Act wasn't alone. It was the first in what became a cascade of state-level legislation over the following decades, a wave of property rights laws that would, cumulatively, transform the legal standing of American women. Massachusetts passed a version in 1855, Ohio and Illinois, both in 1861. By the time the Civil War arrived, more than a dozen states had enacted some form of Married Women's Property Act. The provisions varied considerably, some giving women the right to hold inherited property, others extending to wages, others allowing women to enter contracts in limited circumstances. The variation frustrated advocates who wanted uniform national change, but the direction was unmistakable. The Civil War accelerated everything. Between 1861 and 1865, somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 American soldiers died, the bloodiest conflict ever fought on this soil, leaving behind an enormous wave of widows whose numbers the existing social and legal infrastructure simply couldn't absorb. The widow of a Union soldier was entitled to a pension, but the pension system was new, understaffed, riddled with fraud and bureaucratic failure, and paid amounts that left most recipients in genuine poverty. The widow of a Confederate soldier had, in the immediate aftermath, essentially nothing. The Confederate government was dissolved, the Southern economy destroyed. Women across the South found themselves managing farms, households, and children in conditions of material devastation, without the legal standing to conduct even the most basic economic transactions, in a society whose male labour force had been killed or permanently injured at rates that are still staggering to consider. The visible, unavoidable reality of hundreds of thousands of women managing farms and businesses and households alone, doing it of necessity, doing it with conspicuous competence, doing it without anyone's permission, made the argument against female legal standing increasingly difficult to sustain on practical grounds. This didn't produce immediate sweeping reform. The politics of Reconstruction were deeply complicated. The intersection of women's rights with the rights of formerly enslaved people created fractures in the Reform Coalition that set back women's suffrage significantly. But the momentum of property rights legislation continued, and the infrastructure of formal female legal personhood began to build, gradually and then with increasing speed. The labour movement consequences were significant, even if they arrived slowly. The 10-hour workday movement finally achieved durable victories in the 1870s and 1880s, and women workers were central to building the organisations that won them. The Knights of Labour, one of the most important labour organisations of that era, explicitly admitted women as full members, a radical departure from the practice of most contemporary male unions. Leonora Barry was appointed the Knights General Investigator for Women's Work in 1886. Her reports on conditions in factories and workshops across the country provided some of the most thorough documentation of female labour exploitation that had yet been assembled. Her work directly shaped the growing political pressure for federal labour legislation. The development of the nursing profession is its own case study in what happened when women's caregiving skills were, for the first time, systematically organised, trained, and granted professional standing. Florence Nightingale's reforms in Britain during the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 had shown what trained female nurses could accomplish. The Civil War in America created urgent demand for nursing that the existing healthcare system, almost entirely male, couldn't meet. Dorothea Dix, who had been advocating for the humane treatment of the mentally ill since the 1840s, was appointed Superintendent of Army Nurses in 1861. Women served in both Union and Confederate hospitals in numbers that surprised military authorities, and demonstrated once again that the premises on which women had been excluded from the professions were not holding up under the pressure of events. The legal changes had direct material consequences for women's economic situations. Married Women's Property Acts allowed women to build and hold economic assets across the break of marriage that coverture had made impossible. A widow whose husband had died leaving debts could, in states with property legislation, hold on to property she'd inherited or received before the marriage, rather than watching it disappear into the estate's creditors. A woman who'd built a successful operation, a boarding house, a laundry, a millinery shop, could, gradually and in more jurisdictions, ensure that her business was legally hers, not her husband's, and couldn't be taken without her consent. The education movement of the 1850s and 1860s is another long-term consequence worth tracing carefully. The founding of women's colleges, Elmira in 1855, Vassar in 1861, Wellesley and Smith in the 1870s, created pathways to professional education for women that simply hadn't existed before. And those pathways produced women who entered the professions in the second half of the century with credentials that were difficult to dismiss. Elizabeth Blackwell received her medical degree in 1849 from Geneva Medical College in New York. To the genuine shock of the medical establishment, she'd done the work, she had the degree. The argument that women couldn't do the work had to find new forms, or abandon the field entirely. The 14th Amendment of 1868, which established birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law, was intended primarily to protect the rights of freed enslaved people. Women's rights advocates immediately attempted to use it as grounds for claiming voting rights, arguing that women were citizens and therefore covered by the Equal Protection Clause. The Supreme Court ruled against this interpretation in Minor v. Happersett in 1875, but the attempt and the detailed legal argumentation that supported it built the intellectual framework for the 19th Amendment 50 years later. The legal architecture of women's rights was being constructed in the 1850s and 1860s from materials that would only be assembled into their full form much later. The women who laid that foundation often didn't live to see what was built on it. Eliza Farnham died in 1864, the year Woman and Her Era was published. She was 49 years old. The war was still going. The property rights movement she'd spent years working within was still incomplete. Women's suffrage was still 56 years away. She didn't see the changes that her life's argument contributed to. But the argument was there, in print, in the record, quietly waiting. History is full of this kind of investment, work done at a distance from its returns, significance recognised only after the significance maker is gone. The long-term consequences of the struggle that she and thousands of other women engaged in weren't only legal, they were architectural. They changed the structure of what was possible for American women in ways the women doing the changing often couldn't fully see, but that their daughters and granddaughters would live inside as though it had always been that way. That kind of change, the kind that becomes invisible because it has been so thoroughly absorbed, is the hardest to remember and the hardest to protect. The state-by-state variation in property rights legislation through the 1850s and 1860s created a patchwork of female legal standing across the country that itself tells a story about American political culture. States with stronger reform movements, stronger Quaker or Dutch cultural traditions, or more recently settled territories where the balance of men and women was more even, those states tended to move faster. States where the plantation economy's dependence on enslaved female labour made the question of women's legal standing politically dangerous tended to move considerably slower. Geography, politics, and economics all shaped the pace of change, and they reveal how much the legal standing of women was always a negotiation with existing power structures, rather than a simple, steady march toward justice. The connection between the women's property rights movement and the abolition movement was more than coincidental. Many of the most effective advocates for both causes were the same people, Quakers and evangelical reformers who understood the two issues as expressions of the same fundamental argument about who counted as a full human being under American law. The moral clarity they brought to abolition informed their arguments for women's rights, and vice versa. The backlash against abolition, which intensified through the 1850s as the country moved towards civil war, shaped the political atmosphere for women's rights as well, sometimes opening unexpected opportunities, sometimes consuming reform energy that might otherwise have advanced women's legal standing further and faster. But the work continued, slowly, steadily, building something that would outlast every person who had a hand in building it. The farmhouse in the Santa Cruz Mountains had a view, on clear days, all the way to the bay. The late afternoon light came in golden and low, the way it does in California in the fall, turning everything it touched to amber. Eliza Farnham had sat in that light and written, and argued, and thought, and rebuilt. The woman who had arrived in California in 1849 with 3 companions and a plan that had mostly fallen apart was not the same woman who would write the most ambitious book of her life in 1863. The rebuilding had been real. She remarried briefly in the mid-1850s, a second marriage to a man named William Fitzpatrick, which ended in separation. The full details aren't documented. But what's clear from her writing and the biographical record is that the marriage didn't alter her fundamental orientation toward independence. She continued managing her own affairs. She kept writing. She kept arguing in print and in conversation for women's full legal and social personhood in terms that made her contemporaries either admire her or grow deeply uncomfortable, and often both at once. The transformation arc of individual women like Eliza Farnham and of American society as it slowly, incompletely, messily began to adjust its practices to match more of its stated ideals is worth tracing with care, because the arc isn't a straight line. It curves back on itself, it stalls, it accelerates in unexpected directions. The change that took place in women's lives between 1848 and 1880 was real and significant, and it was also incomplete in ways that subsequent generations would have to continue working on. The arc isn't finished, but seeing where it started helps explain why it bends the way it does. For the individual women who had built lives without husbands in the 1850s, the widows running their boarding houses, the seamstresses who had organised their mutual aid networks, the schoolteachers who had spent a decade educating other people's children, the changes arrived unevenly, and often far too late for their own situations. The Married Women's Property Act of 1848 helped women who had property to hold on to. It didn't help the seamstress who had no property, only wages she couldn't legally claim as her own. The labour organising of the 1850s and 1860s built institutions that produced results in the 1870s and 1880s, by which time many of the women who had done the organising were too old or too worn down to benefit directly from what they'd built. This is the pattern that most social change follows. The generation that bears the cost is not the generation that receives the benefit. The mill workers who walked out in 1845 and got nothing from the Massachusetts legislature laid the groundwork for the labour laws their daughters would work under. The property rights advocates who spent the 1830s and 1840s circulating petitions built the pressure that produced the 1848 Act and the legislation that followed across other states. The women who argued in the 1850s that they deserved full legal personhood were arguing for a world that wouldn't fully arrive in their lifetimes. But here is what the historical record also shows. The women who built lives without husbands in 1850s America, who survived the system, who found the cracks in it, who pushed back against it in every way their circumstances allowed, changed American culture in ways that preceded the legal changes and, in some respects, made those changes possible. By demonstrating continuously and publicly that the premises of the system were wrong, that women could manage property, run businesses, practice professions, navigate contracts, and make sound economic decisions without male direction, they were dismantling the ideological foundations on which the legal exclusions rested. The boarding house economy, which had always been female-run, had by the 1860s become so thoroughly normalised as a form of female enterprise that city directories listed female boarding house keepers without any particular comment. They were there, in the record, as economic actors. The female schoolteacher, who'd occupied such ambivalent social standing in the 1850s, needed but underpaid, respected but quietly pitied, had by the 1870s become the backbone of the American public education system. The argument that women couldn't do the work had been replaced by the argument that they were particularly well suited to it. A different kind of condescension, to be sure, but also an acknowledgement of undeniable competence. Eliza Farnham's Woman and Her Era, published in 1864 and received with the mixture of admiration and outrage she had long since learned to expect, made an argument she'd been building toward for decades. That women's qualities, the ones the era had classified as domestic and therefore private, and therefore without public significance, were actually the highest development of the human species. That a society organised around those qualities, rather than the competing acquisitive qualities of masculine culture, would be a better, more evolved kind of society. It was an argument from strength, not victimhood. It took the very terms the era had used to confine women and turn them into grounds for authority. She died the same year the book appeared, in September 1864 in New York City, while nursing soldiers wounded in the Civil War. She was 49 years old. The irony is dense. She spent her final months doing the caregiving work that the era classified as the quintessentially female occupation, nursing, in service to a war that was, among other things, being fought over questions of who counted as a full human being under American law. She'd been asking that question about women for her entire adult life. America itself was transforming in the decade after her death, in ways that were directly connected to the pressures she and women like her had been applying to the system. The 14th Amendment in 1868, the expanding network of women's colleges, the first women entering medicine and law in numbers large enough to require institutional accommodation, the growing labour movement, slowly and imperfectly beginning to include female workers as full members, state-level property rights legislation continuing to spread west. None of these things happened because of Eliza Farnham alone. History doesn't work that way. They happened because thousands of women, most of them unnamed in the formal record, had been doing the same kind of work she was doing, living differently from what the era prescribed, and insisting quietly and loudly through every means available that the prescription was wrong. The transformation wasn't complete. It isn't complete now, but the shape of the change, the direction of the arc, the logic of the argument, was established in the 1840s and 1850s by women who had nothing to work with except the undeniable fact of their own existence and the clarity of their own understanding. They knew what the system was doing to them. They knew it wasn't right, and they kept going. The women who survived the 1850s as independent economic actors and lived on into the post-Civil War era found themselves in a world that had shifted considerably, but not enough. The boarding house keepers who had built their operations through the 1850s were, in many cases, now prosperous enough to be lending money to their former residents. The schoolteachers who had spent years in rural one-room buildings were finding positions in expanding urban school systems, with slightly more stable work and slightly better pay. Still a fraction of what male counterparts received, but more than before. The seamstresses who had endured the piece rate system were watching the first factories specifically designed for female workers begin to open in major cities. Still far from ideal, but at least buildings rather than garret rooms, with wages subject to at least some public scrutiny. The transformation wasn't uniform, and it wasn't permanent in any individual sense. Women who had built independence could still lose it in a moment, through illness, accident, or the death of a male relative who had provided the legal co-signature on a crucial contract. The legal framework was still deeply unfinished, but the direction of change had been established, and the women of the 1870s and 1880s who were pushing it further were building on a foundation that the women of the 1850s had laid. This is what social change looks like from the inside. Not triumphant and complete, but incremental, cumulative. Each generation adding to what the last had managed, the full structure only becoming visible in retrospect. The candle stub on the writing desk had burned out. She lit another one. The act was so ordinary it barely registered, reaching for the new candle, touching the flame from the dying wick to the fresh one, watching the light spread again across the page. But it was also, if you were paying attention to the century it happened in, a perfect small emblem of what these women understood that their world didn't want them to understand, that the continuation of light is a choice, not a guarantee, that someone has to decide to light the next candle, that the light doesn't carry on by itself. The specific wisdom contained in the lives of women without husbands in 1850s, America is not a simple moral. It isn't that independence is better than dependence, or that women are as capable as men, or that love matters more than law. All of those things are true in their own ways, but they're not what this particular history has to teach. The wisdom here is stranger and more specific, and it has to do with the relationship between legal standing and human worth, and the mistake of confusing the two in either direction. Here is what the era got exactly, catastrophically wrong. It confused legal standing with human worth. It looked at a woman without a husband, without the legal identity that the law granted women only through their attachment to men, and concluded that the absence of standing meant the absence of worth. That the seamstress who couldn't sign a contract was therefore less competent, less rational, less morally significant than the husband who could sign it in her place. That the widow who couldn't legally take out a mortgage was therefore less capable of managing land than the male neighbour who could. The law said these women didn't fully exist, and the era chose to believe the law rather than the women standing right in front of it. This isn't a mistake unique to the 1850s. It's a mistake that societies make whenever they allow the categories of legal entitlement to define the categories of human significance. The enslaved person, who had no legal standing, was not less of a person, but the law said they were property, and too many people chose to believe the law rather than the human beings looking them in the eye. The immigrant without citizenship papers doesn't have less inherent worth than the native-born citizen, but the law grants fewer protections to the undocumented, and the gap between legal standing and human value gets exploited in ways that should make anyone paying attention deeply uncomfortable. But here is the other direction of the same mistake, more subtle, and just as important. You can't correct the confusion between legal standing and human worth by simply affirming worth without fighting for standing. The women in this story who were most clear-eyed about their situation understood they needed both. The affirmation of their worth, the insistence on their dignity, the demonstration of their competence, all of it mattered enormously. And none of it was sufficient without the legal standing that would translate into actual material protection. Eliza Farnham wrote powerful arguments for the moral authority of women. She also worked, practically and concretely, to get women to California where the legal framework was slightly more generous. She understood that ideas without institutional backing are beautiful and insufficient. The specific wisdom this story holds about legal standing is this: it's not a technicality, it's not a piece of paper, it's the mechanism by which a society decides whose claims are real, whose loss can be remedied, whose labour has a price, whose suffering requires a response. A woman in 1850s. America without legal standing couldn't sue for back wages that were owed to her. And this wasn't merely unfair in principle. It meant the wages that had kept her alive could be taken with impunity. It meant the property she'd built could be seized without recourse. It meant the harm done to her had no legal remedy. Legal standing isn't dignity. You can have dignity without it, but it's the mechanism by which a society chooses in practice whether to protect your dignity or ignore it. There is something else in this story too, something about the particular resilience of women who were forced to operate without the safety nets the system had provided for others. The widows who ran boarding houses, the seamstresses who organised mutual aid networks, the schoolteachers who built careers from fragments of opportunity. They developed forms of resourcefulness and institution building that came directly from necessity. The necessity wasn't a gift, it was a burden, and the suffering it produced was real. But the resourcefulness it cultivated was real too, and it generated institutions, practices, and ways of thinking about survival and mutual support that the more protected members of society simply didn't need to develop. This is not an argument for leaving people in hard circumstances because hardship builds character. That argument has been used too many times to justify too many preventable sufferings, and it deserves to be refused every time it surfaces. The women in this story didn't become resourceful because difficulty is good for you. They became resourceful because they had no alternative, and because they refused, most of the time, to let the absence of alternative become an absence of action. The wisdom is more precise than adversity builds strength. It's this: when you're operating without the systems that were supposed to support you, the question that matters isn't whether those systems failed you. They did. The question is what you build in their absence. The boarding house was built in the absence of female property rights. The mutual aid society was built in the absence of formal labour protections. The women's college was built in the absence of female access to established universities. These weren't substitutes that were as good as the real thing. In many cases they were better, more responsive, more human-scaled, more genuinely attentive to the needs of the people they served, precisely because they were built by the people who actually needed them, rather than by people guessing at what those needs might be. The seamstress on Worth Street didn't need someone to guess at what a needleworker in a garret room required to survive a New York winter. She knew. The widow trying to hold her farm in Ohio didn't need a male guardian to explain property law to her. She needed the legal standing to act on what she already understood. The gap between knowing and being empowered to act on what you know, that gap is what legal standing closes, and the understanding that the gap exists, that it isn't natural, and that it can be closed. That understanding is the most durable thing these women left behind. There's one more piece of this wisdom, and it may be the most uncomfortable one for a contemporary reader. The women who fought hardest for legal standing in the 1850s weren't fighting for the right to be left alone. They were fighting for the right to be held accountable in the same ways men were held accountable, to enter contracts and be bound by them, to sign agreements and be required to keep them, to hold property and be taxable for it. Full legal standing is not only freedom, it's also responsibility. And the responsibility was part of what the women asking for it were actually asking for. Not to be shielded from the demands of the world, to be allowed to fully meet them. And there is one final thing this history teaches about the nature of arguments that justify exclusion. Every argument offered in the 1850s for why women couldn't or shouldn't have full legal standing was framed as being in women's own interest. The protection of coverture was for women's benefit. Exclusion from the professions was to spare women from the harsh competitive pressures of public life. Denial of the vote was to protect women from the corrupting influence of politics. The entire architecture of female non-existence was built, maintained, and defended in the language of care and protection. This is a pattern worth recognizing whenever it appears, in whatever era, in whatever form. When the people who benefit from an exclusion are also the ones explaining why the excluded should be grateful for it, the explanation deserves to be examined with considerable skepticism. There is a particular quality to the American self-image, a story we tell about ourselves that has been told so long it feels like ground rather than narrative. It goes something like this. We are a nation of individuals, self-made, independent. We came to this continent, or we were brought to it, or we were already here, or we arrived from somewhere far away, and we made something from the conditions we found. We are a people who believe, with a sincerity that sometimes borders on ferocious, that a person can shape their own destiny if they work hard enough, want it badly enough, and refuse to let the circumstances of their birth define the limits of their future. This is a beautiful story. It's been true enough, for enough people, often enough, to hold its grip on the national imagination across 2.5 centuries. But it's also a story that has been used, with remarkable consistency, to explain why the people to whom it hasn't been true simply didn't try hard enough, or want it badly enough, or weren't sufficiently willing to overcome what was working against them. The bootstrap narrative contains within it, almost structurally, the quiet implication that the people who didn't rise were somehow responsible for the weight of what held them down. The women of 1850s, America who lived without husbands, are a stress test of that national story. Apply the bootstrap narrative to a widow who can't legally sign a contract to sell the property she inherited from her husband's estate, and the narrative breaks. Apply it to a seamstress earning wages she cannot legally control, working in conditions she has no standing to contest, and it breaks again. Apply it to an enslaved woman whose labour builds the wealth of an entire economic system, who receives no compensation, no legal recognition, no acknowledgement of her personhood, and the narrative doesn't break. It shatters. What the story of these women asks us to reckon with as Americans is the distance between the national self-image and the national practice, the distance between the ideal of individual liberty and the legal reality of female non-existence, between the language of self-determination and the systematic removal of the very conditions under which self-determination is actually possible. This distance isn't a footnote to American history. It's one of the central tensions through which American history has been made. The ongoing negotiation between the ideal and the institution, between what we say we believe and what we actually build. The women in this story are part of who we became as a nation, not only the famous ones, not only Elizabeth Cady Stanton writing the Declaration of Sentiments, or Eliza Farnham sailing to California with her small company and her enormous plans. The boarding house landladies whose names appear in city directories and nowhere else. The seamstresses who organised mutual aid societies and are remembered, if at all, only in the aggregate numbers of the labour movement. The schoolteachers who spent decades educating other people's children, whose own names survive in a few lines of payroll records in a county historical society. The widows who held on to farms, raised children alone, and died without monuments. These women are part of what Americans are. Their labour is in the foundations, their endurance is in the institutions, the public schools, the nursing profession, the labour movement, the property rights framework that evolved through their advocacy, and the undeniable evidence of their competence. Their arguments are in the legal record, not only the 19th Amendment, not only the Married Women's Property Acts, but the deeper argument beneath all of it, that legal standing is not a privilege earned by demonstrating worthiness. It's a condition of full human membership in a society. And any society that withholds it from some of its members has not yet made good on its own stated premises. If you're an American woman hearing this, the legal standing you carry, the right to sign contracts, hold property, access credit, appear in court under your own name, cast a vote, none of it is ancient. None of it was inevitable. It was built specifically and deliberately by women who didn't have it, who understood with precision what the absence of it cost them, and who fought for it inside a system designed to absorb and neutralize their fighting. The rights weren't given, they were built, and the women who built them did not, in most cases, live to fully use them. They built them for someone they would never meet. There is something in this, in the building of things you won't live to use, that is distinctly American in the sense that matters most. Not the mythology of individual triumph, which is real but partial. The more complicated, less celebrated reality of collective construction across generations. The understanding that a society is not only what it is right now, but what it is choosing, through its laws and its actions and its treatment of its most vulnerable members, to become, and that what it becomes is the responsibility of everyone living in it, not only the people who already hold power. Eliza Farnham lit another candle when the first one burned out. She kept writing. She kept arguing. She kept living in a way that demonstrated by simple and undeniable fact that the legal categories her society had placed on her were wrong. She didn't win every argument she entered. She didn't achieve everything she set out to do. But she was in the argument. She was present and deliberate, and refusing to accept the terms on which her era wanted to have the conversation. That is what Americans at their best have always done. Refuse to accept the terms on which the argument is offered, when those terms exclude what matters most. The women without husbands in 1850s, America refused those terms. They refused them in ways that were sometimes grand and famous and sometimes invisible and ordinary. They refused them by surviving, by building, by insisting in whatever vocabulary was available to them that the gap between legal standing and human worth was not natural, not permanent, and not acceptable. And the country they helped construct, incomplete, still negotiating with itself about what it owes its members, still measuring the distance between its ideals and its practices, that country is also theirs. We are partly who they made us. The question they leave us is whether we're willing to keep making ourselves. The American identity that emerges from this history is not simple. It holds the boarding house landlady and the plantation mistress. the free black seamstress in Cincinnati, and the California widow fighting to hold on to her land grant. The Lowell mill worker organising a labour association and the middle-class reformer writing pamphlets about the importance of female virtue. These aren't a unified story. They're a collection of intersecting, and sometimes deeply contradictory, stories that we've gradually learned to hold together under the heading of American women's history, though those women didn't experience themselves as a unified movement, and their interests sometimes conflicted sharply. What unites them isn't their experience, which varied enormously. What unites them is the system they were all navigating, the same legal framework of female non-existence, applied with different degrees of force depending on race and class and location, shaping lives in ways both visible and invisible. They were all moving through the same essential architecture, some from far more advantageous positions than others, some of them, honestly, maintaining parts of that architecture for others less privileged, while fighting the parts that constrained them personally. American history is full of this kind of partial liberation, freedom claimed at times at someone else's expense. What we owe to all of them, to the ones who fought the system and the ones who worked quietly around it and the ones who didn't survive it, is the honesty to see them whole, to see the Lowell mill worker and the boarding house keeper and the enslaved woman and Eliza Farnham not as a simple story of heroic women overcoming adversity, but as a complicated story of human beings navigating a system that distributed power unjustly and made different demands on different lives. Seeing them whole doesn't require excusing the injustices they faced, or celebrating the ones they perpetuated. It requires something harder. It requires the willingness to hold the full weight of what the history actually was. The last light over San Francisco Bay came in flat and cold off the water. It turned the distant hills the colour of old copper. She'd been in California 6 years by then, and she'd learned something about California light. It doesn't soften things the way Eastern light does, filtering through trees, through humidity, through the quiet smoke of old cities. California light is direct. It shows you exactly what's there. What was there in the fall of 1855 was a country in the middle of deciding what it was. Eliza Farnham sat on the hillside of her Santa Cruz farm and looked west toward the water. The compromise that had held slavery in place while the country expanded was starting to unravel. The territories of Kansas and Nebraska were bleeding. John Brown was moving through the national consciousness like a knife. The question the founding generation had refused to answer completely, who counted as a full human being under American law, and what followed from that answer, was demanding to be settled. And the demand was getting louder. She was working on a book about women. For years, she'd been turning over a specific question. What would a society organised around women's values actually look like? Not just caregiving and mutual obligation on paper. Not a society where women ran things the way men always had. Something genuinely different. A kind of society that counted the things that had always been left out of the ledger. It was in many ways an impossible question for 1855. The world she was describing would require things that didn't yet exist. Legal standing for women, yes. But also an economic framework that recognised domestic labour as productive work. A political system that weighed the interests of children and future generations alongside the interests of current property holders. A public culture that saw caregiving not as a female addition to civilization, but as one of civilization's central acts. None of these things existed. Most of them couldn't even be fully put into words with the language available to her. But she wrote the question down anyway. She wrote it in a book published in 1864, the year she died. Not enough people read it. Then it was largely forgotten for over a century. She wrote it knowing the answer wasn't coming soon. She wrote it knowing she wouldn't live to see it. She wrote it because the question mattered, and questions that matter need to be written down, especially when the answers aren't ready yet. The question she was asking in 1855 is still being asked. The specific legal architecture she fought against has been substantially taken apart. Women have had full legal standing in the United States for generations now. The particular forms of exploitation she documented, piece rate wages below survival level, the inability to hold property or sign a contract, the formal non-existence under coverture, those have been formally abolished. That abolition is real. It matters, and it was hard won. It took generations of women doing the work that Eliza Farnham was doing, the work that came before her, the work that came after, and yet, the question she was actually asking, not just do women have legal standing, but does this society count all the things that matter? That question is still largely unanswered. The domestic labour that women still perform, in proportions that far exceed men's contributions, is still largely invisible to the economic systems that assign value. The caregiving that holds families together and makes everything else possible still doesn't appear in GDP. It doesn't count towards social security. It doesn't get classified as productive in the frameworks we've built. Women who spend years raising children are economically vulnerable in ways their husbands often aren't. That gap hasn't closed. It's changed shape. It's taken on new legal forms. But anyone who studies the 1850s carefully enough would recognize the underlying structure. The American future isn't written. It never has been. The country built partly by boarding house landladies, seamstresses, and widows of the 1850s. The country argued into being in part by Eliza Farnham writing by candlelight in a California farmhouse, is still deciding what it owes the people it's historically undervalued, still trying to reconcile the mythology of individual triumph with the structural reality of who gets to rise and who has their footing taken away. The question she wrote down in 1855 and died before answering is still open. What would it look like? What would it cost? What would it require to build a society that counts everything, not just the things that have always been counted, but the labour that happens in rooms that never appear in ledger books, the work that keeps the next generation alive, the intelligence, the competence, the moral clarity that has always been there and has always been undervalued, the strength that would have been lost entirely if the women in this story had been as small and as limited as the law said they were. She lit the candle and went back to the page. The bay was dark by then, the hills invisible, the water more a sound than a sight. She had maybe 9 more years, though she didn't know it. She had a book to finish, an argument to make that no one had made quite this way, about things no one was fully ready to hear, in a country that was about to tear itself apart over a different version of the same fundamental question. Who is fully human, and what does the answer require of us? She kept writing. In America, that's what you do when the answer isn't there yet. You write the question down so clearly, so precisely, so undeniably, that the people who come after you can't pretend they never heard it. Somewhere in this country tonight, in a room the ledger books don't count, in a kind of work that still doesn't appear in any official measure of value, someone is doing what she did, keeping something alive in the dark, waiting for the light to be enough. There's a specific form of American forgetting that this story is vulnerable to, and it needs to be named directly. It goes like this. We acknowledge that things were hard for women in the past, we note that things have gotten much better, and then we use that comparison as evidence that no further change is necessary. It was hard before, it's better now, so it's good enough. The story of women without husbands in 1850s, America is sometimes used this way, as historical contrast that makes the present look adequate. It shouldn't be. The past isn't there to make the present feel comfortable. It's there to make the present legible, to show us the structure of what we're living inside, clearly enough to see where the work still is. The women who built the foundation we're standing on, who argued in the 1840s and 1850s and 1860s that women's legal non-existence was not natural and not inevitable and not in anyone's interest. They weren't arguing for a world that would be good enough. They were arguing for a world that would count everything, count all the labour, count all the people, count all the ways human beings contribute to the ongoing work of keeping each other alive, raising children, building communities, passing knowledge forward, caring for the sick, teaching the young. They were arguing, in the vocabulary available to them, for a more complete accounting. That accounting isn't finished. The ledger books still leave things out. The frameworks we use to measure value still miss things that matter. The women in garret rooms and farmhouses, in gold rush boarding houses and prison reform institutions, in the quiet corners of 1850s America, they knew this, and they built what they could with what they had. And they left the question open for the people who came after them. The question is still open. The candle is still burning, passed from hand to hand, across the dark. Some of these women stitched clothes late into the night, or took in boarders just to keep a roof over their heads. Others signed their names in ledgers as widows, their lives quietly reshaped by loss or absence. Their stories were rarely written down, but they were lived every single day. If tonight felt a little softer because of them, that's enough for bedtime sleepy. Rest now.